Hello YouTube, the Sponge Sir speaking with the 5th episode of Flipping Tables. This episode will be about World War one of the deadliest and destructive wars of the 20th century. What I've dug up to speak about is incredible. I'm positive you'll be amazed. Today we'll be talking about 1. The Schlieffen Plan, never even being considered. 2. The Schlieffen Plan succeeding. 3. The Zimmermann Telegram. 4. Franz Ferdinand never being assassinated. 5. Germany's plan to invade the Americas. 6. The Battle of Tannenberg and Russian Revolution. 7. Invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula. 8. The Hundred Days Offensive. 9. Ottoman's never ally. 10. Jutland. To start out, we'll talk about the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan was designed by Count von Schlieffen, and it involved a surprise attack on the French and Russians, developed as early as 1905, but put into effect in 1914 when the World War broke out. The idea is that the Germans, once either war broke out or had the ability to conquer Europe, is that most men would attack the fortified French through Belgium, considered the greatest threat, and simultaneously a small group of men would surprise attack the Russians. It was believed that it would take 6 weeks for the Russians to organize themselves and retaliate, meaning that the Germans fighting the French would need to conquer France in 6 weeks so the Germans at Russia could survive. Once World War I broke out, Berlin decided to enact the plan. However, things did not go as expected. The Russians proved a greater fight than expected, even if they were off guard. Therefore, the Germans did not have as many men fighting the French. The Germans and their blitz assault was halted at the First Battle of the Marne, and the French survived the onslaught. The Germans then adopted trench warfare, exactly what we remember of the war today. Now, what would have happened if the Schlieffen Plan was never considered? Had Schlieffen's plan either been rejected or never deployed on the field, the World War would be almost entirely different from what we now know it as. Without Schlieffen's new plan, Germany would not have much of an idea of how to attack their new enemy. Likely, since Austria first declared war on Serbia, which was heavily allied with Russia, the Germans would attack Russia first in a swift manner, knowing that the French would eventually wage war against them. With nearly their entire army against the Russians, with a small group defending Germany's western border, Russia would soon fall. Then, the entire war would be waged on an offensive against France. However, now they'd have their much-needed men from the Russian front. Britain would jump into the war as soon as they did in our timeline. However, Germany would be unmoved. The war would wage on for many, many years in a much, much different way. To start, the Germans were the first to adapt trench warfare due to the fact that they did not want to lose any of their gained French territory, knowing that their offensive was over. Without them bringing it into war at such a large scale, it'd rarely be seen. This would also mean that much of the technology from World War I and beyond would have never been created. For example, after French hunkered down into their own trenches, the Germans developed chlorine gas to drive them out. It was the first chemical weapon in all of history to be used on such a wide scale. Without the trenches, the Germans would have little reason to develop chlorine weapons. Not only that, but the British would have never developed tanks. Tanks were created by the British to drive the Germans out of their positions. They weren't having much success with just infantry. With only 5 of those rolling on the field, 30 kilometers of land was gained by the British. The Germans soon retaliated by creating their own tanks, and they became a huge portion of the war's strategy and tactics. However, there's other scenarios for this too. Had the French declared war as soon as Austria did and attacked Germany, the war would be over before it began. Or, had the Germans felt split between who to attack and never launched a full-scale invasion, and instead gave troops to Austria and let them decide, who knows? The war could have unfolded in many, many different ways. Now, if the Schlieffen Plan had proven successful, had Schlieffen's plan proven successful and both wiped out France and Russia in a fell swoop of only 2 months, the Central Powers would have almost definitely won the World War. With only Britain as a major power against them in Europe, the Americas would have been drawn in immediately. The British would have to fight on the offensive. However, even with entire Allied support, it would be unlikely they'd be able to liberate France. The Germans, however, would not be able to wipe out the British, as they'd simply be too powerful for the invasion. The Ottoman Empire would either conquer or ally with Greece, as you must consider Greece was divided with the national defense government and their leader Eleftherios Venizelos, who supported the Allies, and the royal government, who supported the Central Powers. If Allied attention was entirely diverged from the Ottomans, they'd likely be able to silently forge an alliance with Greece's royal government and support their efforts for control of Greece and attack Italy soon after. Even if the Ottomans could not keep the royal government afloat and Venizelos gained power, the Ottomans could have easily conquered Greece. After some time, Italy would have been overrun by the Ottomans, especially if the Germans had provided assistance, and soon you'd have a war of 2 countries on each side, America and Britain against Germany and the Ottoman Empire. It's entirely unknown to me who would have won, yet I'm willing to bet the Central Powers. Even if the countries were evenly matched, America would be fighting a war 4,000 kilometers away from its shores. Eventually, people would be sick of the warfare, and an armistice and eventual peace treaty would be made. Perhaps the Germans would have control of all of Europe excluding Great Britain, and the Ottomans of the Middle East and North Africa. It'd be a much different world had anything gone differently with the Schlieffen Plan, it's clear to see. Now, we'll discuss Franz Ferdinand never being assassinated. Franz Ferdinand was an archduke in Austria who was heir to the throne. However, before he could inherit it, he was assassinated at Sarajevo in 1914 by Serbian nationalists. Soon after, the Austrian government used it as an excuse to declare war, creating a list of terms Serbia had to agree to or else war would be declared. The Serbians agreed to all but one term. However, Austria considered it reasonable enough to declare war. Now, what would have happened? Had Franz Ferdinand not been assassinated, it would not affect the possibility of the war breaking out too much. As was seen throughout the events after the assassination, it truly was just a spark to explode a powder keg. The two countries were ready to war against each other. They just needed a reason to do it. What's noticeable about this event is how the Archduke was assassinated. The Archduke had been misspoken about for years, as well as his wife. They had married in a morganic relationship, or unequal as far as royalty. The Emperor, Franz Joseph, was strongly opposed to this relationship, as well as others. They soon spoke poorly about the couple, leaving a negative remark to people around the world about him. Eventually, hate piled up against him, and Franz Joseph sent Ferdinand to Sarajevo against his will, which was also a Serbian-influenced town. The truth of it is, Franz Ferdinand was a kind person who was really much better than he seemed, and his wife, Sophie Chotek, was pure and wholesome who was a perfect lover for Ferdinand. It was the overall disrespect and betrayal of aristocratic Austrians that caused the assassination of the Archduke. Now, moving on, let's discuss the German invasion plans of the United States. The Germans had seemed all but preoccupied throughout the early 20th century in Europe, with three massive empires it had to worry about: its own, the Austrians, and the Russians. However, in 2002, it was discovered that the Germans had planned to invade America during the late 1890s and the early 1900s. However, due to a lack of needed warships and the unrealistic theme of it, the invasion was never enacted. Now, it's not directly related to World War I, it was a bit earlier, yet note that first is incredibly interesting, and second, the emperor who had enforced the creation of these invasion plans was the same as the emperor who declared war on Serbia in association with Austria, and that act of aggression soon led to the French, British, and eventually Americans to join in on the fight. The plan involved first crippling America's navy, then a land invasion of Hampton Roads Harbor, later changed to New York City's harbor, and then a pincer attack towards Boston by invading Cape Cod and Rockport, another peninsula towards the north. Note that they did not actually plan to conquer the United States, however simply weaken them and make them less prevalent in world politics. Not only this, they also wanted influence over all the other countries in the Americas, as at the time the United States had nearly all the influence. Now, what would have happened? Had these three plans been considered, it'd be unlikely they'd be able to successfully invade. The United States had a larger country, had a larger influence, and of course a larger population. Although the Germans outnumbered the Americans military-wise 6-1 by 1900, there would have been many more Americans who would have enlisted for the cause of defending their country. It would have been a difficult fight for both sides. I doubt the Germans would have been able to make much of a gain in the United States, and any gains would have been retaken within a few months. However, realize that wasn't necessarily their goal. Instead, it was just to weaken the United States. They definitely would have caught the states off guard. However, I'm not too sure whether the Germans would be able to hugely weaken them. What this would majorly cause was an earlier World War I for a different reason with different participants. It would perhaps be Germany, Austria, and Mexico, with Mexico and Germany being the main fighters, poised against the United States, Britain, and the French, with most of the fighting taking place in the Americas. The Russians may not have even been involved, which would in fact mean they never had a reason to overthrow the Tsar. Now, you may be a bit confused if you do not know what caused the Russian Revolution. Therefore, we'll discuss it now. The Battle of Tannenberg was a key decisive victory for the Germans at the very beginning of the war, which led to a distrust in the Russian Tsar Nicholas II. Soon, the Russian people overthrew him and adopted a socialist system, exactly what caused the Cold War. It involved over 200,000 Russian soldiers pitted against 150,000 Germans. The Russians had a nearly 75% casualty rate. With this major defeat in mind, it'd be illogical not to fear. The Russian people knew that the Tsar would be unable to defend his people and his country. At the same time, the peasants were all but through with their mistreatment and deplorable work conditions. Therefore, they considered it reasonable to revolt. Two revolts followed. The February Revolution to overthrow the Tsar, leading to a dual power system between the Provisional Government and the Soviets. The October Revolution soon overpowered the Provisional Government and left the Soviets in charge. All this chaos soon led to the Russians to form an armistice with the Germans and pursue to have their own civil war between the socialists and those who opposed. It's easy to see that the socialists won. That's how the USSR was formed. Now, what would have happened? Had the Battle of Tannenberg been won by the Russians, assuming a close battle, the Germans would not hesitate to push on. They'd likely take at most a 2-week break to regroup and attack a different flank. However, the Russian Tsar would soon realize he needed to shape up both his military and his country. He'd likely try to improve workers' conditions and then immediately make a call to arms. While the new men are training, the old would hold their line. Assuming the best for Imperial Russia, they'd be able to rearm and recreate themselves. Yet this is assuming the Tsar does everything perfectly, which is something he'd never even come close to doing throughout his entire reign. It's what caused the terrible work conditions for the peasants and his inadequate military. He lost the Russo-Japanese War just 10 years earlier. Overall, it'd be very difficult for the Russian Tsar to prevent his eventual downfall, yet more incredible things have happened. Now, on to the Hundred Days Offensive. The Hundred Days Offensive was a massive push by the French, American, and British forces, which overwhelmed the Germans at the Hindenburg Line and led to their surrender and neutering. It began after the Second Battle of the Marne, at least the idea did. Marshal Ferdinand Foch of the French army saw the German dismay and decided it was time for an assault. Once he secured the Amiens railroad junction, Foch's mind truly began to spin. He devised a four-stage plan, which included that the Americans would strike in the Meuse Argonne, then the British and French would work to strike east toward Cambrai, and later capture Flanders. Finally, the main assault would proceed on the St. Quentin Canal, right on the Hindenburg Line. Ferdinand Foch's plan was a huge success, yet the Germans remained in a nearly delusional state. Oblivious to the deteriorating state of the war, they stood strong and changed little about their intentions. Eventually, late into the offensive, the Germans eventually knew it was a case of holding their line, yet even then they could not repel the Allies. The Allies fought incredibly hard and smart, to say the least, throughout the Hundred Days Offensive. They were relentless and pierced through everything the Germans had. This momentous success soon led to a German collapse, leading to desperation and a surrender soon after. The Allies effectively neutered Germany, removing their army and forced them to pay for all war costs. With no allies to assist, Germany soon entered hyperinflation during the 1920s in an attempt to pay it off. Now, what would have happened? Had the Hundred Days Offensive failed, perhaps the Germans would not have been neutered as much as they were previously. With the offensive halted, the Germans would finally be given time to recuperate and reform. This could mean they would be able to give the Allies a much more difficult fight and delay the end of the war for a few more years. Nonetheless, the Germans would eventually lose the war, as it was evident that the Germans would lose eventually, especially with the entrance of America into the war. However, the Allies would be willing to be more lenient with the surrender terms and perhaps not be as harsh on the Germans, if it meant a shorter war. What this could mean is that the Germans would never enter their abysmal state during the interwar period, the time period between World War I and II. With more stability in the country, the people would have faith in the Weimar Republic and never adopt Nazism, possibly sparing the world from a Second World War, at least for a while. With that, let's view the invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula. The invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula was a failed invasion by the British on Ottoman territory. With nearly 250,000 men lost to the Ottomans, it showed the British that the Ottomans were a force to be reckoned with and never tried such an assault again. British morale and prestige faded soon after, yet it wasn't anything fatal. They were soon recovered from it and continued to push hard for the rest of the war. Now, what would have happened? Had the British successfully invaded the peninsula, it'd truly be worse for the British, contrary from what it may seem. With a new front the British would need to worry about, they deployed many more men to continue through the entire peninsula and eventually the Ottoman Empire. This would mean the British would leave few men to fight in Europe, meaning the war would drag on longer. The British would ultimately regret the decision, knowing they dug themselves in far too deep. Now, we'll view the Ottomans never siding during the war. The Ottoman Empire was initially neutral throughout the First World War. However, after seeing the success from the Germans on the Russian front, the Ottomans, specifically Enver Pasha, the Secretary of War, viewed the World War as a chance of glorious victory. They entered the war initially against the Russians, attacking multiple naval ports and attempting to invade. The Russians retaliated to their best effort, however they eventually made an armistice with the Ottomans once Imperial Russia began to collapse. Although it was mainly caused by the Germans, the Ottomans believed they had major influence in the Russian collapse. They spoke greatly about themselves, even though they had not necessarily done very much. The Ottomans were, of course, a force to be reckoned with, as was seen in the Gallipoli Peninsula and other major battles. However, they did not overindulge themselves in the war, as there were multiple problems within the country itself. The Ottoman Empire soon began to wind down after the Allies captured major amounts of the Balkans, specifically Bulgaria. Soon after these gains, the Ottomans knew defeat was inevitable and formulated an armistice. Now, what would have happened? Had the Ottomans decided to never involve themselves in the First World War, it would easily hurt the Central Powers and help the Allies. With one less force to worry about, the Allies would be able to focus entirely on Europe and not have to divert their attention to the Middle East. And of course, without the assistance of Ottoman troops, it'd take less time to defeat the Central Powers. Not much of the actual war would change, however. Tactics and strategy would go on virtually untouched, and the goals and ideas of each side would remain unaltered. Finally, we'll cover the Battle of Jutland. The Battle of Jutland was one of the few German attempts to break the British Royal Navy's blockade. The Germans lost the battle strategically, however they took out a multitude of British ships. Nonetheless, the Germans had never attempted anything like it again, and the blockade remained throughout the rest of the war. Now, what would have happened? Had the Germans successfully broken the British blockade in the Battle of Jutland, it would do much more than simply allow a German trade route. If the Germans were to in fact break the British blockade, World War I would enter into a whole new field, naval. The Allies and the Central Powers would work to create a massive amount of ironclad ships, and we'd see many more naval battles throughout the war. It'd be a huge showcase of ironclad ships, which were just recently created, in fact as recent as the American Civil War. Would be yet another huge advance that took place during the World War One. Perhaps we would see some of our modern naval technologies created during World War One. I'll never be able to determine. With that, the 5th episode is concluded. I hope you've enjoyed. I've worked hard on it, and I found out a lot. I hope you did as well. See you soon.